Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, exciting news for Johns Hopkins. Michael Bloomberg announced that he's giving a $1 billion gift to the medical school there.
Is it in order to fight the scourge of guns in these United States? That's usually what he does.
This is to make medical doctors. According to Johns Hopkins, with this gift, they'll be able to give free tuition to students of families earning all the way up to $300,000. And they'll also cover living expenses and fees for students who come from families earning $175,000 and down.
Well, that would be awfully nice if they did it.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things here. One is, it's really cool that this is the kind of thing we talk about in a market environment that, you believe in this sort of thing, so give the money. And here Bloomberg has done this. One of the things that people need to be careful about, and I'm sure that Michael Bloomberg has done his homework here, but people who give smaller amounts than $1 billion often don't, is that universities are notorious for using the money for things that the donor did not intend.
Yeah, I don't know that I trust Johns Hopkins only because, and I mean this, only because I don't know if I trust any university.
I would agree with you there. I wouldn't trust any of them, but there was a donor some years ago who did something fascinating. He gave an amount, I believe it's about $5 million, to the University of Missouri to found a free market economics center. The money was given on condition that it be used to hire free market economists. And what did University of Missouri do? It went and hired a bunch of socialist economists. And this made noise.
If only someone could have seen that coming. Oh, wait, they did see that coming. What happened next?
Yeah, what he had done in the gift, he said, all right, fine, I'm giving this to University of Missouri, but understanding how incentives work, he said in the gift that if it isn't used for what he intended, it goes to Hillsdale College. So University of Missouri have to give it up and give it to Hillsdale. So that immediately set up Hillsdale as a watchdog. So Hillsdale's watching.
Yeah, no, that's right. It perfectly incentivized Hillsdale.
Yeah. And sure enough, what happened is Missouri is hiring socialist economists. Hillsdale calls them on it. It goes to court, and University of Missouri ultimately settled. I guess by this time, the endowment had grown from the original $5 million to around $9 or $10 million. University of Missouri agreed to give half of it to Hillsdale. So basically the original $5 Hillsdale got. So with what's left over, I'm sure that Missouri will keep on hiring socialist economists.
Funny how that happens too. Alas, what can you do?
Yeah, but that's a word of warning to anyone who would donate. Actually, and I shouldn't pick on universities here. I've seen this with nonprofits in general. There's this mission drift that occurs over a couple of decades. And before you know it, this entity that you gave money to or even founded to do one thing ends up doing something completely different.
Yeah, I will say this. If you're looking to give money to a college or a university, you're far better off picking out a student and giving the money to that person.
Yeah.
Let the student spend it at the school. Don't let the school spend it on the student. Let the student spend it on the school.
You and I talked about this perhaps 2 decades ago when free market donors were giving money to universities to set up free market centers. And we said at the time, don't do that. Not only are you going to have this mission creep, but the university takes a chunk of the money. I know at Duquesne it was something like 40% as overhead, right? So 40% tax from the university right off. We said, look, if you want to give money for free market education, give it to faculty.
That's right. Endow a professor.
Yeah, here's Professor X, and we're going to give $1 million. Maybe we're not going to give it to you directly, but we're going to put it in an endowment that's going to pay you. You then can go out onto the market and say to any university you like, hire me. I come complete with a salary. And what you'd get is faculty would naturally, in this case, free market economic faculty would naturally congregate together in institutions that were supportive of them.
Yeah, that's right.
If the institutions ceased to be supportive, they'd move somewhere else and the salary would go with them.
All these years later, I still think it's the best of a bunch of ideas.
It is. I think you get better outcomes at pennies on the dollar.
I guess our advice, fund students, fund professors, do not fund universities.
Yeah.
And there you go. I've got this odd combination this week, Ant, of an interesting news item and a foolishness of the week. It's just all wrapped up into one story. And I think it's a real sign of the times. It's the sort of thing that we're going to see more and more of as the technology becomes more ubiquitous. But damn near everybody uses Slack at this point. I bet even you use Slack. Isn't that right?
Actually, I stopped using it. We do not use it at the institution I'm at. I mean, it's the first time in maybe 5 years, 7 years, I haven't used it.
I'm a little surprised that you don't. Slack has become kind of like Zoom. It's just the default, right? Everybody's using it. And when everybody's using it, you know what's going to happen next. Let me read to you the first sentence of a news story I came across today. A hacking group claims to have leaked internal data from the entertainment giant Disney, including Slack messages and attachments from the company's employees.
Yep. That's why we don't use Slack.
A lot of data, and not only a lot of data, but in the case of Disney, this means unreleased movies.
Oh,
in no
yeah,
small
of course.
part.
Yeah.
Right. All kinds of intellectual property has found its way into this leak. Their entire development Slack has apparently been dumped. 1.1 TIB, which is roughly the same as terabytes. Not exactly, but roughly. Files and chat messages, all downloaded and packaged up and then re-released into the wild.
Good Lord. Wow.
And if you think this isn't going to keep right on happening, you're crazy. The real question is, how the hell did they get into the Slack of Disney? And once in, how did they have access to everything? Because I'm in all kinds of Slacks, and I don't have access to everything in any of them.
You're not a hacker.
I guess that's right.
So let me get this straight. Are you saying they downloaded like partially completed or draft versions of movies and whatnot?
Yes.
Good
Yes.
God. Wow.
Yeah, this is an absolute disaster for Disney.
Yeah, because you could picture in draft version, movies that might otherwise in finished version be really good could be quite crappy. And word's going to get out. Oh, don't go see this movie. It's lousy.
I remember years ago having access to the first Incredible Hulk movie before they inserted all the CGI.
Yeah, but that was bad.
So buses and stuff would just go flying, but there would be nothing moving the bus to have it go flying. And you run that risk, right? These movies are not complete. They're not going to be all that wonderful. But here we are. It's all fun and games when it's a bunch of movies at Disney. But what about when it's Raytheon?
Right.
You know, it's defense contractors and things like this. You know, Brave New World, and all kinds of things are going to happen, and they're going to be, generally speaking, quite horrible. Can you be careful enough? And I don't know that you can be anymore.
This has got me thinking. There are a number of people in free market circles who don't believe that intellectual property is a thing.
Yeah, it's a thing.
I don't count myself among them. I do think intellectual property is a thing.
I have never been one of them. That intellectual property is an absolute thing.
Yeah, all you have to do is write a book or write a song, and all of a sudden you're very interested in intellectual property.
I'm going to make it way easier than that. All you have to do is ask yourself, without intellectual property rights, how many new medications are you going to get?
Right, yeah.
That, to me, seems to be rather important by way of an observation.
This foolishness that you just described brings new color to that argument, because someone who says no, intellectual property is not a thing would then have to conclude that it's perfectly fine if you hack into Slack and take the partially completed movie and spread it around, and people say, no, this is a lousy movie, I'm not going to see it, and then the movie never gets made because it's dead in the water before it ever begins. You could see all of these problems, but the problems are coming about because there's no intellectual property that you're free to just take this thing and share it.
Well, I don't suspect these people are going to get caught. And there were almost 10,000 Slack channels that were collected and dumped. So everything Disney didn't want you to know about is now out in the wild.
Yeah.
Good luck and God bless. But, look, like I said, it's all fun and games when it's Disney. Well, what about when it's Raytheon and it's national defense or, some kind of weapons system? You want to live in that world? That's a tough world to live in.
Mm-hmm.
And now we wait.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. Was that your foolishness?
It was everything I'm talking about today.
Okay. Then let's move on because I want to talk about recession.
You mean that thing that we've been in for the last 50 years?
Yeah, I have to start you off with a famous quote. It's attributed to Harry Truman. It's not entirely clear to me that it's original to him, but it's attributed to him. And the quote goes, "It's a recession when your neighbor loses his job. It's a depression when you lose yours." That's about right, I think.
That is about right. To hear people talk about it, we've been in a recession for years.
People do say this, and there was a study, it skips my mind who conducted the study, but there was a study not too long ago. I shouldn't say study, it was a survey not too long ago, in which 50% of Americans surveyed said that they believed that we were in recession. Already, not headed for it, but already in it.
50%? Now, look, this is a technical thing. You're either in recession or you're not, and we could go look it up.
Yeah, it is. Now, part of the problem is that the data doesn't come in until later. So even the economists who have the data can't say for certain we're in recession or not right now. The best they can do is say we were or were not in a recession 3 months ago.
Yeah, no, it's going to lag by about a quarter, correct?
Yeah, something like that. But here's the thing. There is a technical definition for recession. There is no technical definition for depression.
Well, let's stick with recession for now. What is the technical definition?
The technical definition is more than I can go into. The rule of thumb that people employ is two quarters of negative GDP growth. So 2 quarters of the economy.
2 consecutive quarters.
Yeah, 2 consecutive quarters. And that's, roughly speaking, that's okay. It's not the exact definition, but it's good enough for...
But, that's plenty good enough for jazz and
yeah, it's good enough.
Work, right?
But here's the interesting thing. It's interesting that depression doesn't have a definition, and yet unequivocally, we can call whatever the period was, the 1930s, the Great Depression. And we can call it a depression even though there's no definition, because there was no question it was so bad that it couldn't have been anything else. I give you an analogy, not an analogy, but a comparison. Think back to April of 2020, when COVID hit its peak and we had 15% unemployment in this country. We were at 15% for, I don't know what, a matter of days, right? It was certainly not all of April, but we peaked at 15%. Now, 15% in the Great Depression was actually pretty reasonable. Great Depression peaked at 25%, and it was above 15% for not a matter of days, but 9 years straight. It was above 15%.
It was my recollection that we were at about a third unemployment, about 33% unemployment at the height of it.
Yeah, depending on how fine you slice it, whether you're talking monthly data or quarterly data or whatever, the highest I saw was 25. But nonetheless, you get that high, it doesn't matter at this point, right? When one out of every 3 or
right.
1 out of every 4 people are unemployed.
And, conversely, 2008 was never a depression in anybody's mind.
Oh, no. Nothing has come close to the Great Depression.
Yeah, it was the Great Recession. Everybody even knows to call it that.
Right. Yeah.
And yet, this idea that we're in a recession right now has almost no support, and we certainly haven't been in a recession in the last 2 quarters trailing.
No, we haven't been. And going back to this rule of thumb of 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, so the economy actually shrinking, we haven't even come close to that. We're at, I think the lowest that I saw was like 1.7% or 1.8%. And while that sounds pretty low, it takes a lot of effort to move from 1.8 to 1.6 or 1.5, right? So 1.8 is solidly above zero. You know, we'd much rather it be 3, but it's not negative. And if you look at forecasts, I've got a panel of 40 forecasters that I monitor regularly. None of them, 0 of them, are forecasting a recession out to 2025. That's even amongst the most pessimistic of them, right? So, yeah, we're not in recession. And if you look at the fundamentals, nothing is pointing in that direction. And yet people believe. Here's the poll. Found it in my notes. It was a Harris poll. Over 50% of Americans said they believe the economy is already in recession. And then another 50% believe that unemployment is at a 50-year high.
Well, which is it? Come on.
No. I mean, those two go together. 50% say they believe.
Right.
No. It's not the other. Again, sorry. It's not the other 50%. It's 50% of Americans believe the unemployment is a 50-year high. Do you know, the truth is we're actually at almost at a 50-year low for unemployment?
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah,
actually.
Yeah, the news there is remarkably good. And how people think it's bad, I don't understand. Although you gave me a clue into this a few days ago.
I've been thinking about it quite a lot. I think I'm generally right. I don't know how right I am, but I think I'm generally right. But nonetheless, go ahead.
You said to me that you believe people are seeing inflation. They're seeing the high prices, and they're interpreting that as recession. That is, it's painful. Of course, it's painful that prices are high. And the more I thought about it, the more I think you're right.
To regular people, bad economic news is bad economic news.
Yeah, right. Yeah, recession equals bad news. High prices is bad news, therefore recession.
And look, prices are incredibly high, comparatively speaking, right? If you go back to 2019 and compare the price levels today to then, we are paying an absurd amount of money for all kinds of things because, that's how inflation works. It's compounding.
Yep.
Every year, this 4% gets added to that 5%, and then 3% more on top of that later. And, well, before you know it, it acts like an investment. And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger with each passing year.
It's down now. I should be careful how I say this. Inflation is down now versus when it peaked a year or so ago, but it's still not back to where it was. The consumer inflation is like 3.3 or 3.4 or something like that, when prior to COVID is more like 1.5 to 2, somewhere in that range.
Right. Nonetheless, right, as inflation comes down, prices don't.
Oh, yes.
What would have cost you $100 at a grocery store in 2019 might well cost you $160 now.
Yeah, and people have adopted a new terminology for this, which I actually kind of like. They use the term disinflation, where disinflation means you've still got inflation, so prices are still going up, it's just not as bad as it was before. As opposed to deflation, which is prices actually going down.
Right, and deflation is what everybody thinks they want. Now, whether they actually want it or not is another question entirely. I would love to see groceries back at 2019 levels.
Yeah, that's not happening.
I'm going broke just buying food.
Yeah, the best we can hope for is that the inflation gets under control enough that our wages can catch up with that. But that takes time. You're talking years.
It'll be at least 2 or 3 more years, assuming that inflation slows down.
Yes, that's assuming it slows down. Now, having said all of that, people, I think, somewhat lose their minds saying that, well, because of the inflation, we're actually worse off than we were, 5-10 years ago. That's actually not the case. Even with the inflation that we have endured and continue to endure, the median full-time worker's wage, after adjusting for inflation, is almost 10% higher today than it was a decade ago. And that's not the average guy. That's the median guy, the guy in the middle.
Right. I would still like my wages to be much, much higher than they are right now. And I would like prices to be much, much lower. But there's a great example. I moan about groceries, but I've been helping my daughter look for a car lately, and the prices on used cars have come down precipitously.
Really?
Oh, yes. They're probably down 40% in the last 2-3 years. Mm-hmm. And it's a matter of supply and demand, largely because of the chip supply, which worked on the new car supply, which then dipped its toe into the used car market, et cetera, et cetera. But, these things move in both directions.
Yeah, and here's an interesting thing, because I've said this same conversation we were having. I posted some things about inflation on social media, and people came back at me saying, no, that can't be right. Inflation can't be 3%. I know that this, that, and the other thing are now costing 20% more than they did last year. And here's the problem. When you think about inflation like that, you have a tendency to see much more clearly, because it's painful, the prices that go up. You tend to be much less cognizant of the prices that go down. So if you're trying to do this at a gut level and say, well, what's inflation? Right off, you're going to get a biased number because of psychology.
Yeah, and I think psychology plays even harder when it's things like food.
Right, yes. Yeah, things that are near and dear to you, sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not like you've got a choice.
Yeah.
You can't decide you're not going to eat ever again. You could decide to live without this streaming service or that. Well, you're going to have to buy food.
Yep.
I don't mind telling you, I have been told from on high here in this house that I'm not allowed to have Coke Zero anymore. And that kind of pisses me off real hard.
Oh, those are fighting words.
It kind of is. And, what the are they going to take away from me next?
I think you're right. People notice food because it's near and dear to them. I think another thing they notice is gas prices.
Yeah.
Because
that's right.
It's the one thing that when you buy, you're standing there staring at the numbers tick up and up and up as you fill up your tank. I don't think you have that experience with anything else you purchase.
Well, and more than that, when your tank is empty, you have no choice.
Right, yeah, it becomes like food. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
I remember the first time I looked up and I saw a $68 tank of gas.
Yeah.
That was horrifying. I couldn't believe it because I remember quite clearly $17 tanks of gas.
Yeah. In fact, James, I was looking at that data just the other day because back when gas went up to whatever it was, $4.75, I think it hit $5 in some places.
This is the non-California version.
Right, yeah. Yeah, $5 is normal in California.
$5 is cheap in California.
People were losing their minds about the price of gas. We had their podcast running at that time, and we said, look, give it 6 months and gas prices will be back to where they were at the $2 or whatever it is. And people lost their minds and said, no, that's just not possible. You have this sense that, when some bad news comes along, it's there to stay. And we said, no, look back at the last time that gas peaked at that level. It took about 6 months for it to come back down. And people said, no, that was then. Things are different now. It's permanently at $5 a gallon.
Things are always different now.
Exactly. They're always different now. But I was looking at this data just a couple days ago, and we were absolutely right. 6 months after that episode, the price of gas was back down to where it had been prior to the spike.
Look, gas was a lot more expensive in the mid to late 2010s or 20-aughts. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, we were up over $4.50 a gallon back then.
Right.
And we're not there now 15 years later.
Yeah.
That matters. It certainly doesn't offset the food prices. And look, you know who's really hurting right now? Restaurants. If you think it's expensive to go to the grocery store to buy food, try going to a restaurant to buy it.
Yeah.
And fast food has gotten so incredibly expensive that you're actually better off going to fast casual now. A meal at McDonald's might well cost you $15.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can go to almost any restaurant in Tucson, probably 2/3 of them, and get something under $15.
Yeah.
Right? Fast food is no longer the cheapest option, and people are starting to realize that. That's going to have an effect over an entire industry for a very long time.
One last thing I want to say about recession is it's strange in that a recession can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You could have, and I think that's a situation we have right now. If you look at the fundamentals, and by fundamentals I mean, producer prices and employment levels and income levels and delinquency rates and all the numbers that actually matter, can people pay their bills? If you look at those numbers, they're all looking good. But if people believe they're in recession, they're going to cut back on spending. They're going to start saving because they're afraid they're going to lose their job because we're in a recession. And as they do that, sales start to slow, and businesses then will start to lay off people. And people who didn't believe we were in recession are going to see that, and they're going to start to say, oh my God, they're right, we are in recession. They're going to cut back. And before you know it, you actually do have a recession. Not because of any of the fundamentals, but because people simply believed you had recession. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I suspect there's no way around that. As long as people perceive the world the way they do and then act upon their own perceptions, I don't see a way around that.
People trust their own, and I don't think they're right in doing this, but they trust their own experience more than they trust the numbers. And what they miss is that their experience is often atypical. I would say virtually all the time it's biased because of they're seeing certain things and not seeing other things.
That's got to be right. Bias plays so completely in our own lives in almost every way, right? In every aspect of our lives, our perceptions are biased.
Yeah. Yeah, so too here, yeah.
That's not a dirty word, right? That's just a simple fact of the matter. I cheerfully admit that my perceptions are biased in many ways. I can't imagine who wouldn't be so candid as to admit that. And yet, when it comes time to make long-term decisions, you have to flush as much of that out as you possibly can because you're acting on bad information.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
When you act on bad information, you get bad outcomes. Who of us would want bad outcomes?
Maybe with regard to inflation, there's one more thing to be said. And that is, people are going to come back and say things like, well, okay, maybe prices are only going up 2 or 3%, but the cans of soup are smaller, or the, patty of beef is lighter, or whatever it is. And I'll remind people that economists take that into account. We call it shrinkflation. So when we say, the price of a hamburger has gone up, whatever it is, 5%, I don't know what the number is, that's net of whatever adjustments in size or quality the producer has imposed.
And when people complain about that nonsense, it's the same exact thing as when they are convinced that something isn't adjusted for inflation when you give them the numbers.
Yeah. Do you know how many times someone has said that to me, James? I said, well, it's not adjusted for inflation. I say, well, it is adjusted for inflation. Here it is. And they come back with, yeah, but your inflation numbers are wrong. I think, what do you want?
What the hell? What the hell is that? I have heard thousands of times that something I'm talking about was not adjusted for inflation. When I say, of course it was, how else could we talk about it rationally? People look at me, they think it's this gotcha thing that they can just say, and that they'll somehow always be right, but it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's become a kind of a joke around our house. I'll go outside and say, oh my God, it's hot outside. And my wife will say, yeah, but have you adjusted for inflation?
It's the danger of marrying an educated woman, yet you get smarted off to morning, noon, and night. Morning, noon, and night. But, so it goes. I don't suspect that there's going to be any way you and I are going to talk people out of incorrect assumptions with the economy. the best we can do is offer the obvious truth to the people who will listen. And I'm getting to the point where I just don't think that many people are listening, not to the obvious truth, right?
And I suppose along those lines, we can throw out a little bit of good news, which is that in the same way that recessions can be self-fulfilling prophecies, so too can expansions.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.